We'll get to that in a moment. Mr. Jeneroux, seconded by Mr. Viss, moves that Bill C-220, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code, Compassionate Care Leave, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Debate, the Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverbend. Now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Practice makes perfect. I'm honoured to rise here today to discuss my private member's bill, Bill C-220, an act to amend the Canadian Labour Code, Compassionate Care Leave, builds on my work in the Alberta legislature, and I'm thrilled to be able to share this bill with my colleagues here. This bill proposes to extend compassionate care leave by up to 3 weeks after the death of a loved one. Given everything that has happened over the last several months, I think we can all agree that compassionate care leave is as important as ever for Canadian families. I'd like to pause for a minute, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister of Labour, her staff, as well as a member from Mount Royal, for their advice and guidance during this process. This bill continues off of their work established during the expansion of bereavement leave. Compassionate care leave is a job protective leave that allows an employee to take time off to care for a family member with a serious medical condition with a significant risk of death within 26 weeks from the date a medical certificate is issued or when leave is granted. The leave is available to full-time employees of federally regulated workplaces. Currently, employees who have at least 600 insurable hours during a 52-week qualifying period can seek the leave for a maximum of 28 weeks during the year. Benefits are provided for a maximum of 28 weeks, with 1 to 2 weeks of unpaid leave serving as a qualifying period. The employee receives EI benefits of up to $573 a week, or 55% of their weekly earnings. This time is vital for many families, Mr. Speaker. When a loved one receives a potentially terminal diagnosis, it is stressful to figure out the logistics of who will provide the care. Often, many people don't think that they can take time off to care for their spouses or parents because they simply can't afford it. Having compassionate care leave allows families to focus on caregiving while still receiving a portion of their salary. Getting to be with a family members in their final days is incredibly important and meaningful. Compassionate care leave has been a saving grace for thousands of families around the country. Now, what happens after a caregiver's loved one passes away? Right now, the leave ends immediately, and the employee is expected to be back at work within days of their loved one's death. This leaves little time to plan a funeral, get affairs in order, and most importantly, grieve. Returning to work with days of a loved one's death is the least compassionate part of a compassionate care leave program. I think all of us in the chamber can agree that it takes more time to process the death and get back into the headspace of work as opposed to just one day. Bill C-220 proposes to extend job-protected compassionate care leave beyond the death of a loved one. The extension can be up to 3 weeks, depending on how much compassionate care leave the employee has taken. Employees who have taken close to the maximum leave of time would get an additional 1 week, Mr. Speaker, beyond the death of their loved one. Employees who have taken between 4 and 20 weeks of leave would get an additional 2 weeks of leave past the death of their loved one, and employees who have taken fewer than 4 weeks of leave would receive an additional 3 weeks of leave beyond the death of their loved one. I decided to structure the bill this way, Mr. Speaker, as someone who's already taken most of their time allowed under the Compassionate Care Leave program will likely already have had end-of-life arrangements made, compared with someone who's only been on leave for less than a month. While I worked on this bill, I wanted to be as fair as possible to employees while also being fair to employers. If this bill is passed, more than 18,000 federally regulated employers will be impacted by the changes. These employers fall under a variety of sectors, including air transportation, banks, crown corporations like Canada Post, radio and television broadcasting, railways, telecommunications, and businesses that are vital or essential to the operation of a federally regulated workplace. We understand that employees are vital to the success of these corporations and businesses, and I think we can all agree that having employees return to work in a clearer state of mind after taking additional compassionate care leave is better than returning to work before the employee is ready. About 11,000 Canadians used Compassionate Care Leave program in 2018, and this was an uptick in usage after the amount of time allowed was extended 2 years prior. The average duration of Compassionate Care Leave is between 4.8 and 12 weeks. The amount of people using the program is expected to rise in the coming years as our population ages and more Canadians are finding themselves in a caregiving role. There is support for extending the length of leave. The Quality End-of-Life Care Coalition of Canada recently submitted its pre-budget consultation to the government, and among its list of recommendations was that the compassionate care benefit should be extended to include a 2-week period for grief and bereavement. This coalition is made up of 34 national stakeholder organizations dedicated to improving end-of-life care for Canadians. In their submission, they wrote, and I quote, "Family members, potential recipients of the compassionate care benefit may need support as they grieve the loss of a loved one and try to manage numerous strains and stresses. By adjusting the compassionate care benefit, more Canadians will have access to the time necessary to heal economic hardships and take care of some of the more practical business following the death of a loved one." At the beginning of the speech, Mr. Speaker, I mentioned how the past few months, as our country and the entire world has dealt with COVID-19, have demonstrated how important a program like Compassionate Care Leave is. The virus has given us perspective on the value of spending more time with family and friends. We've all heard the news reports about family members who couldn't see their loved ones in hospitals or nursing homes before they died. This is heartbreaking, and I'm sorry that any family member has had to find themselves in this situation. There is a huge importance of being with a loved one in their final days, and Compassionate Care Leave facilitates that. It allows families to be together and even for the terminally ill person to die at home in some cases. This program has vital importance to our society, Mr. Speaker. Now, if you don't mind, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to share a personal story about why Compassionate Care Leave is important. When I was just starting out in my career, my grandma became very ill. At that point, I was young and in my 20s, competing with several others for a full-time job. I wanted to spend as much time as I could with my grandma, but I also worried that what would happen to my job if I did. Would I be fired? Would I be passed over for an opportunity? So I decided to stay at work, Mr. Speaker. That's a decision I regret to this day. My grandmother, Jean Babcock, passed away a few weeks later. At that time, there wasn't a Compassionate Care Leave program in Alberta. Employees in the same situation like me had no choice but to keep working or take unpaid time off, which could also impact their jobs. After I was elected to Alberta's Legislative Assembly in 2012, I began to work on introducing a Compassionate Care Leave program in the province. All other Canadian provinces had such a program at that point in time. For 2 years, I worked on my private member's bill. I talked with researchers and families who all spoke about the importance of having such a leave, that a person is the greatest time of need in their last few weeks of life. Being able to be with a loved one in that time, to help them in any way they need, to say the proper goodbyes, is a treasured gift for many families. I'm pleased to say that my bill passed and Alberta became the final province to introduce job-protected compassionate care leave in early 2014. 6 years later, I stood in this chamber to introduce Bill C-220 and build on this vitally important program. I did this because I saw a gap in the leave program. Many stakeholders and families told me how they were grateful to spend the final days with their loved one, but the days following the death of their loved one felt rushed and stressful. Many had to return back to work before their affairs were in order, before they had time to fully process the death and start the grieving process. From these stories, I saw an opportunity to make the Compassionate Care Leave program even better and to help more families who are going through such difficult situations. Allowing additional time off following a loved one's death is something I felt could strengthen the program and greatly help caregivers who are grieving. Mr. Speaker, I hope my colleagues can agree with me that such an extension is important. This program has the support of all parties. In fact, the Conservative government pledged to extend the Compassionate Care Leave program from 6 weeks to 26 weeks. This government followed through on that commitment to extend the Compassionate Care Leave program in early 2016. At the time, the government said it was also working on plans to extend the program so that more Canadians could take advantage of it. I hope my colleagues can see that Bill C-220 presents just that opportunity. Now, some of my colleagues may ask why such an extension is necessary. After all, we have bereavement leave and 10 days of unpaid personal time off work. An employee currently taking compassionate care leave could use those options if they want extra time off. However, these options may not be realistic for some families. An employee who is only allowed 3 days of paid bereavement leave after a family member dies. The remaining 2 days are unpaid. The 10-day personal time off is also unpaid. Not only is it unpaid, but it leaves no flexibility for employees in a different personal emergency comes up later in the year. As I mentioned before, the average length of compassionate care leave is between 4.8 and 12 weeks. So the majority of people who take the leave would be able to receive the extension my bill proposes without exceeding the 26-week threshold. This would allow them to continue receiving EI benefits of compassionate care beyond the death of their loved ones, using unpaid bereavement days or unpaid sick leave after a loved one's death just isn't feasible for most people who can't afford such a loss in income. Most people cannot go 2 weeks without a paycheck, and that's why extending the compassionate care leave benefit is superior to using the personal time and bereavement time. With my bill, more Canadians will be able to have that extended time off. I'm willing to continue to work with the Minister and my colleagues to get this right for Canadians. Mr. Speaker, no doubt all of us in the House have experienced the loss of a family member. It is devastating and it takes time to recover from such a loss. We're fortunate to have a great program like Compassionate Care Leave in Canada to help employees spend time with their loved ones in the final days. It is a great gift for many families who wouldn't otherwise have the financial means to take time off work to become a full-time caregiver. My bill aims to fix a gap that has become apparent, and that is in the need of some additional time off following a loved one's death. This allows employees who are taking compassionate care leave to make funeral arrangements, get all affairs in order, and start the grieving process before returning back to work. Returning to work with a clearer state of mind is no doubt more beneficial to employers in the long run, rather than rushing back someone to work before they're ready. As our population ages, we will have more family members stepping into caregiving roles and taking job-protected compassionate care leave. We need to ensure that the leave provides such sufficient time for these caregiving employees and their families. We all know the importance of family, and the last few months of chaos and uncertainty have cemented this importance. Upholding compassionate care leave and ensuring that the program has enough supports for employees who use the program is vital. One way to provide more supports is by extending compassionate care leave by up to an additional 3 weeks to allow caregiving employees more time to grieve and settle affairs. I hope that I have the support of my colleagues in this House, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to working together so that we can make smart changes to this program to better help more families. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak about Bill C-220, an act to amend the Canadian Labour Code, Compassionate Care Leave. It is truly such an honour to introduce this bill.